Your young servant Silvestro Pritoni, rejoicing in a voice sufficiently good to practice music and wishing to retain it, begs your serene highness to make it such that he is without those instruments which would allow the change of voice to take place.
During the 18th century, as many as 100,000 small boys were castrated to preserve their high singing voices. Of these, a mere handful became the most famous singers of the age. The world's first international superstars, they were perhaps the greatest virtuoso singers ever heard on earth, the castrati. But the mature castrato voice didn't sound like a child, nor did it sound like a woman.
Nothing in the whole of music is as fine as the fresh young voice of a castrato. No woman's voice has the same firmness, the same strength, and the same smoothness.
And it didn't sound like a male countertenor or falsettist. In this film, we're going to explore the sound and the world of the Baroque operatic castrati, and in a unique scientific experiment, we'll attempt to bring something of this lost voice back to life.
For the whole of my adult singing life, I've been fascinated by the castrati and the extraordinary music that they sang. These kings of the 18th century operatic stage were the richest, the most highly sought after, the most extraordinarily virtuosic, the most pursued in many ways of all the singers we've ever heard. And for 200 years now, they've been extinct.
The thing that made the castrato voice special appears to be the effect that that singer had on the audience. If one can understand something about what the special nature of that sound was, it will help us understand what it is that communicates from one human being to another.
To do this to a child when every single moment, every day of their lives will be frankly adversely affected by their physical appearance, their early osteoporosis, their lack of an ability to reproduce, it seems to me really not emotionally cost-effective.
They are jealous, despicable, fierce, effeminate, gluttons, covetous, cruel, inconstant, suspicious, furious, insatiable. They cry like children if they're left out of an entertainment. The knife has indeed made them chaste, but this chastity is of no service to them.
Nicholas Clapton, a countertenor and castrati historian, is curator of a new exhibition in London devoted to the German composer Handel and his castrati.
Handel was the first great composer to write Italian opera in England. Handel was absolutely the business as an opera composer, and as such had enough clout to hire the very finest singers, including some of the greatest castrati the world has ever known. Caffarelli, Senesino, Carestini, Guadagni. The only one he never got hold of was Farinelli. I'd like you to meet three gentlemen I like to think of as friends of mine. There's Farinelli and Senesino and Guadagni by the window. Farinelli never worked for Handel. Senesino did for about 15 years, and here he is on stage in Handel's Rodelinda, about to sing the most famous aria from that opera, Dove sei. Guadagni was much younger than the other two singers. He was described as a wild and reckless singer, and was accused of quite a few amorous adventures while he was in London. He was such a good actor that eventually he was famous as Glux Orfeo. Well, a Baroque opera fanatic might like to make out that castrati were specially invented to sing lots of notes on an 18th century stage. This is, of course, nonsense. Castration has been used as a punishment, as a means of subjugation for thousands of years. We certainly know of eunuch choirs in a Christian context as early as the 4th century in Constantinople. And there they flourished for more than 800 years, until the time of the Fourth Crusade, when Constantinople was sacked by the forces of Western Christendom. And the castrati, who had been singing there with great fame and considerable scandal, suddenly disappeared off the face of the earth.
But 400 years later, castrati suddenly reappeared in Italy. In 1589, Pope Sixtus V reorganized the choir of St. Peter's. Castrati would now take the high parts that had previously been sung by either boys or falsettists.
Falsetto means a little false voice, which is really grossly unfair, because there's nothing false or unnatural about a falsetto voice. It's a perfectly normal function of any adult male. And the irony is, however, that it was the castrati who came to be referred to as the natural soprano, soprani naturali, which seems very strange to us.
Nobody in Britain understands both the natural and the synthetic human voice better than York University's electronics professor, David Howard.
The voice of the castrato worked in the same way that my voice or your voice works. This is a medical model of the larynx which shows us the basic working parts. This is the Adam's apple, the part you can feel if you move your finger up and down your throat. But if we turn it so we can see into it, we can see the vibrating structures, the vocal folds themselves. And as they open and close like this, they would be vibrating. And these vibrations are very rapid. If this was a boy's larynx, the length of the vocal folds is around about 5 millimetres. In the case of women, it's nearer 8 millimetres, and the man, it's 1.4 centimetres. So for the boy's voice, with the small vocal cords, the boy also has a small mouth, or vocal tract, above that, and he is able to produce a sound which many would describe as being pure, rather simple. The woman's voice has slightly larger vocal cords, but they're working into a mouth cavity which is rather bigger. And so she is able to work with a larger range of acoustic possibilities in colouring the sound. Men sing in a range that's roughly an octave lower. The man also has a vocal tract, or mouth cavity, that's much bigger. But men are able to sing in the same range as a boy or woman by using what's known as falsetto. To produce a falsetto sound like that, what I'm doing is reducing the bulk of the vocal cords that are vibrating. And I'm doing that by setting the vocal folds up so that if you were looking straight into my larynx, you would see the vocal folds like this, and they would be vibrating like that. We call that full body contact of the vocal folds. But for falsetto, we pull the bulk of the vocal fold material out of the way, and only the top edges can vibrate. So we have a thin string, and a thin string will vibrate at a higher frequency. The castrato voice was not falsetto. The castrati had larynxes of boys, and therefore their natural pitch range was up there with the boys and the women. But in addition, they had a man's vocal tract, so they had all the sonic timbral possibilities that a man has, and big lungs. So their power source was huge. They could sing high notes, and they could sing them for a long time.
what people are really interested in is the operation. And here we've got three things with which the operation was done: a lancet, a cauterizing iron, and a castratore. This little pair of 18th century secateurs would have been used to remove the whole of a child's scrotum at one fell swoop. Could, of course, be heated to red heat as well to do the cut and the cauterization at once. That was one method. Another, neater method, if one may use that word, a neater method, was to use a lancet to make an incision in the scrotum in order to cut the seminal vesicles. And then this little cauterizing iron, which looks like something you might crimp pastry with.
Well, the consequence of castrating a child before puberty is huge. Testosterone comes primarily from the testes, and that loss of testosterone has innumerable effects. Obviously, you don't go into puberty properly, your voice doesn't break, you don't start growing a beard, genital development doesn't occur. They tend to grow tall because fusion of the growing ends of the bones doesn't occur, so they would have had very long arms and very long legs. And the chest goes on growing as well. They look pale because testosterone stimulates the bone marrow to produce more blood. They obviously have abnormal fat deposition. They don't get the massive muscle enlargement which you get with a man who has normal testosterone secretion. So their whole appearance would have been hugely interesting, unusual.
They have the look of a crocodile, the grin of an ape, the legs of a peacock, the paunch of a cow, the shape of an elephant, the brains of a goose, the throat of a pig, and the tail of a mouse.
For Georgian Britain in particular, the Italian operatic castrati were a hugely problematic paradox.
Opera in this country has always had a very mixed reception. It was imported for precisely the same reasons that it was attacked. It was elitist, it was foreign, it was sung, it was false.
What is there to fix attention? Recitative that is not understood, and songs unintelligible from complex sounds and want of articulation.
As the Italian language is looked upon as a necessary part of polite education, and therefore it is to be supposed understood by all in this higher rank of life, and as the Italian opera is established solely at the expense of these, they who do not understand the language need not go to the entertainment, nor do they have any right to condemn those who do.
The castrati are the epitome of Italian opera, and of course they're also the epitome of the problems with Italian opera. Castrati were halfway to becoming women. They weren't quite men. And women in the 18th century couldn't think for themselves. They were totally irrational. They needed managing by men. If castrati start influencing the young dandies of the day, it could be appalling for Britain's future.
Curse on this damned Italian Pathic mode. I hate this singing in an unknown tongue. Does our reason and our senses wrong? I curse the unintelligible ass who may, for aught I know, be singing mass.
Catholicism was a major problem for Georgian England. In fact, it had been a major source of hysteria since the Reformation. Castrati, of course, were these great Catholic figures. There was a charge levelled against them that what they sang in these operas was actually Catholic messages in disguise.
Anyone may see with half an eye, religion is more their business than music.
Despite this widespread prejudice, Italian opera and the castrati had some dedicated champions in Britain. In the 1770s, The music historian Charles Burney travelled throughout Italy in search of accurate information about these singers. But even then, this was a culture shrouded in secrecy.
I inquired throughout Italy at what place boys were chiefly qualified for singing by castration, but could get no certain knowledge. I was told at Milan that it was at Venice that it was at Bologna. But at Bologna the fact was denied and I was referred to Florence. The operation most certainly is against the law in all of these places, as well as against nature. And all the Italian so much ashamed of it that in every province they transfer it to some other. Bologna looks melancholy, though parts of it are very magnificent and beautiful. Clergy in very great abundance, and the churches immensely rich.
The church in Italy was one of the first employers of the castrati, but their attitude to the procedure and the whole business was very ambiguous, not least because it had to be. In the church's own canon law, any mutilation, castration included, was actually illegal and forbidden, and anyone who carried out castration would be punished by excommunication if found out. And that was a terrible thing. There's been an often quoted figure for how many boys were castrated in any one year at the height of the craze for the castrati, say in the 1720s and 1730s. It was probably about 4,000 per annum. And this was a craze that lasted on and off for a hell of a long time in the 18th century. So how about at least 100,000 boys castrated in the service of music?
It is generally people of the meanest description who give their children for such horrible mutilations in the hope that they may be able one day to support their parents.
The child would have been restrained by several adults and drugged by what means they had then.
Sometimes they used to give a certain quantity of opium to persons designed for castration, whom they cut while they were in their dead sleep, and took from them those parts which nature took so great care to form. But it was observed that most of those who had been cut after this manner died by this narcotic.
They pressed the jugular veins, which made the party so stupid and insensible, he fell into a kind of apoplexy. And then the action could be performed with scarce any pain at all to the patient.
Well, maybe even the church wouldn't have been a big enough power to drive this gruesome operation for several centuries on its own. It's an extraordinary coincidence of musical history that at the same time as the castrati were first coming to prominence in Italy, we have the birth of the great Baroque form of opera.